At the moment, the hour is pointing straight up. That's at 7 o'clock. But we've had such interest in this topic that there are still people trying to register. So I apologize for beginning late, but we are beginning. This is the 33rd annual Winter Lecture Series. So you are most welcome. And by the way, it's likely to be the Winter Lecture Series that has drawn the most interest in the last 10 years or so. We have not seen so many people so packed in as is the case right now. My name is Dick Dienstbier. I'm a member of the committee that oversees the Winter Lecture Series. Our other members of the committee I'd like to just mention briefly: Chuck and Barbara Francis, David Forsyth, David Iaquinta, Peter Levitov, W. Don Nelson, Shedid Sate, and Bob Stoddard, and my wife Karen Dienstbier, who doubles as the artist who's provided all the paintings that are out there in the reception, the gallery room actually is what we call it. The program subcommittee responsible for putting together this particular topic of inequality of income and wealth is Shedid Sate, Jerry Petter, and Wes Peterson. Wes is going to be your first speaker, so you'll get a chance to meet him. Officially, the Winter Lecture Series is sponsored by the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Church. As always, however, this program is also brought to you by Humanities Nebraska, a statewide nonprofit organization inspiring and enriching public life by offering opportunities to thoroughly engage with history and culture, with additional funding from the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. If you enjoy this type of programming, please consider supporting Humanities Nebraska with a contribution. Donations are matched by state and federal funds. Your support helps preserve our past and inform our future. We had you sign in, by the way, because Humanities Nebraska wants to know who comes to the programs they sponsor. This year we have 5 lectures beginning now, today of course, and continuing for the next 5 Sundays. The 6th session will be a panel discussion on the same topic with new people. That is, the speakers that you'll see in the first 5 are not those who will return for the panel discussion. As always, our format is to have a lecture that lasts approximately an hour. Take a break for 10 or 15 minutes where you can get up, stretch, find the restrooms, get a snack in the gallery room, which is behind this wall. Admire the paintings. Don't feel shy about telling me if you really, really like them, because I'm the husband. I get some credit. And then after the break of 10 or 15 minutes, and typically it's by this time close to about 8:20, people come back in here and we do Q&A until 9 o'clock, and that's one time point which we keep religiously. We do quit exactly at 9 o'clock. The 5 lectures are going to be on the Unitarian website. That's www.unitarianlincoln.org. They are being recorded by Brendan Evans, who is sitting over here with the headphones on and who has been responsible for much of our publicity this year and has done a job that we are most grateful for. If bad weather should occur, probably won't, of course, but if we have some sort of a blizzard or something that comes, then you can determine if the lecture is canceled by going to that same website on which the lectures will be posted. Again, it's www.unitarianlincoln.org. And speaking of possible cancellations, our Professor Liam Downey from the University of Colorado has taken ill with something that's pretty severe. As a result, although he was scheduled to come on March 5th, he will not come at that point, and we will substitute someone who will engage the same general topic that Professor Downey was going to speak about. The topic being the way in which wealth inequality and income inequality affect the social, cultural, and physical environment, and vice versa. So our first speaker is Wes Peterson, who will speak to you tonight. The second, Eric Thompson, Director of Business Research at UNL, and his focus will be income inequality as it impacts Nebraska. Donna Jean Barton from the UNL Political Science Department will do an analysis of our last election and how the issue of income inequality and the reality of income inequality have affected that election outcome. I've heard her talk about this once, and it's really interesting. On March 5th, we will hopefully have a substitute for Professor Liam Downey from Colorado. March 12th, Chuck Collins of the Institute of Policy Studies in Massachusetts will be our speaker. He's a really interesting person who inherited hundreds of millions of dollars, is that fair to say, Jerry? And gave it all away, feeling that inheriting that amount of cash is really kind of inappropriate. And he really believes in the issue of income inequality. He's lived it. And again, March 17th, the panel discussion. We of the Winter Lecture Series partner with OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. OLLI has been very helpful for both indicating, advertising, if you will, announcing these Winter Lecture Series. And I noted as I was looking over the list of the people who are on the Winter Lecture Series committee that only about 2 or 3 of them are not OLLI members as well. I hope you take that as a recommendation. If you don't know much about OLLI, Google OLLI in Lincoln, Osher Lifelong Learning in Lincoln, and learn something. It's a wonderful organization. In the future, to guide our advertisements and our announcements of these lecture series, we would like to know this year what your primary source was for learning about the Winter Lecture Series. So I'm going to ask you to do the uncomfortable thing of raising your hand. And you might even raise it a couple times if there were a couple of sources, but I'm going to read through these fairly quickly. On Saturday, there was an article in the Lincoln Journal-Star, the front page of the second section, Wealth Inequality is Focus of Lecture Series. How many of you came largely because you learned about it there? All right, it looks like a good dozen to 15. Good. Information is disseminated by OLLI in their Friday morning, actually. OLLI Friday Happenings is what they call it, where they make announcements about what's going on with Osher Lifelong Learning for the week. How many of you learned about this lecture series either from those Friday announcements or from announcements in OLLI classes? Whoa, okay, I'm going to say that's 45, 50? KUCV did a Friday live program on Friday morning in which Jerry Petter and Shadid Sait talked about the Winter Lecture Series. Anybody come here as a result of hearing that?
It was a nice interview.
It was a nice interview, yes it was. Two people. I was interviewed on KZUM a couple of weeks ago. Anybody come as a result of that? No, I didn't think so. We do a email mailing that comes to all the people who have in the past subscribed to our email list. How many people came or have been strongly influenced by that email mailing? I'm going to say 30, 35. And finally, there's a paper mailing that comes from the Unitarian Church that essentially comes in an envelope and your mailman delivers it. How many from that? Oh, that's a bunch. That's another 40, I think. We're almost done with this. I'm grateful for your patience. Let's see. Also, the Unitarian Church sends out on its monthly announcements and what's called an e-blast, a blast of email to people. How many folks come as a result of that? This would probably be only people who are Unitarians. Looks like almost 20. Word of mouth? Another 15. Okay, terrific. Also? Facebook. How many Facebook? Yeah, Shelley, 4 people. Most of you have discovered that there's overflow parking across Eldon Drive from here, and you can use that parking lot. You know the restrooms in this church are down that big hallway you came in, and you take a right as soon as you can down a sort of a smaller hallway, and you can find restrooms. Hearing assistance is available, but you must see whoever is running the booth down here. We're out, don't ask for any. Jerry Penner will introduce today's speaker. Jerry.
Thank you. Great to see all of you here. I could speak extensively about Wes Peterson, but fortunately I won't. I do want to tell you a little bit about Wes. He's a professor of agricultural economics at UNL. I've known and respected Wes for more than a quarter of a century. He is a broad-gauged, broad-minded scholar teacher whose academic training was in anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley, in public affairs at Princeton, and in agricultural economics at Michigan State. He has extensive international experience beginning with his Peace Corps work in Benin, and he has been involved professionally in Europe, Africa, Asia, and Central America. That's a pretty good portion of the globe. Wes's primary research and teaching interests are in international trade, agricultural policy, economic development, and ethics. He is, of course, an author of books and professional articles, and he has developed a solid and productive interest in economic inequality, both national and international. He is a most adventuresome teacher, leading study tours to Benin, and even more bravely, he recently, humanely, led an undergraduate seminar through a careful study of Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. Went over this carefully with undergraduate students at the university. That's enough for me. We are very fortunate that Wes has agreed to start the 2017 Winter Lecture Series with an overview of important issues related to inequality. Welcome, Wes.
Thank you. Thanks, Jerry. Thanks very much. Can everybody hear me? I've got a thing here, and I probably ought to use this mic because I'm going to wander around a little bit. I don't have any notes. I'm just going to work off the PowerPoint stuff. So, you all have, or at least some of you have the sort of handout that we distributed. That has a purpose. The front page has my email and phone number, and I would encourage you, if you feel the spirit to do this, please feel free to contact me about further information and so on. Let me tell you what I can offer to you. The honors seminar that I do, of course, has to have a syllabus for it, and so I have a syllabus available which has a very extensive bibliography attached to it. So if you're interested in something like that, I could certainly share that with you. To help some of the students get through all the readings, the Piketty and other big books that we read, I put together a reading guide, which is now about 100 pages, single-spaced. If you're a real glutton for punishment, I'd be happy to share that with you. And of course, I'd be happy to send you the PowerPoint slides if you're interested in that. I think let me see if I can make this work here. The organizers of the Winter Lecture Series this year, I think, have clearly hit on the topic. It is of great interest to a lot of people. The turnout this evening on a lovely February evening, believe it or not, it's not 14 feet of snow out there, but it's amazing to see all of you here, and I'm very pleased to be able to interact with you this evening. President Obama, Bernie Sanders, Pope Francis have all weighed in saying that inequality is one of the defining issues of our times. The polling suggests that most Americans would sort of agree. About 2/3 of Americans think that income and wealth are not properly distributed in the United States. And an equal proportion sort of feel that the economic system in the United States unfairly favors the interests of the rich. This is a little bit more of an issue for Democrats than for Republicans, but even a majority of Republicans, 54%, think that income distribution is not appropriate at the moment. So I think there's a broad general kind of consensus that this is an important issue. I won't go through this. The basic structure is I'm going to try to give an overview this evening, and then the other lectures will sort of drill down on some specific aspects of the problem, and we'll end up with a panel discussion at the end. My goal this evening is to try to lay the groundwork for the subsequent lectures and give you sort of an overview of all the main issues. And I want to do that sort of in three parts. First is a little bit of technical stuff about the meaning of inequality, economic inequality, and how we might measure it. I mean, if people are going to make claims, which they do, that inequality has increased, we have to have some way to measure it, right? So that we could know whether or not that's true. So that's a little bit technical. I'll try not to be too boring on it, but we'll get out of that fairly quickly, hopefully. And then the second section, I want to try to trace through the evolution of inequality over a fairly long period of time. We'll have a little interesting story, I think, tell about that. And then, what is the current situation? Now, for that part, I'm going to follow. This is, and if anyone wants to look at these over the break, I brought 2 books. I've got a whole shelf full of stuff that I could have brought. This one, I'm going to refer to quite a lot this evening. This is by an economist named Branko Milanovic. We actually invited him to come and do the lecture series, and he very kindly replied that he would love to, but that he's booked up this spring, so we'll have to have me as a substitute. But I think he uses a framework that I think is very useful. It's sort of the idea that when you think about inequality within countries, within the United States, what is the degree of inequality in the U.S., how has it changed over time, and so on. How do we compare with Sweden, for example? So that's within country inequality. The other kind of way, another way of looking at inequality is to think about the differences between countries. So average incomes in the United States are 34 times the average incomes of people living in sub-Saharan Africa. So that disparity between countries is very significant and very important. And then the final level of inequality to think about is for the world as a whole. This would be comparing the poor people living in a slum in Calcutta with these 8 billionaires who have wealth. 8 people have wealth holdings that are equal to the wealth held by the bottom half of the world distribution. That's 3.6 billion people. So the disparity between people who are in dire straits around the world and are very wealthy, that would be your global inequality. So. Then the final section that I want to work on, and I've been timing myself, and I think I may be able to get through 1, 2, and 3 before we decide to have a break. But that's okay, because after the break we can come back and kind of work on this last section, which I think is sort of more of some interest. Is inequality really a problem? If it is, what can we do about it? And you have the slides in the handout that will be part 4. So you will have that information whether we get to it or not, depending on how things go. So, and we can use that as kind of a template or a jumping off point for thinking about discussion about those kinds of questions. The other thing that's in the handout, there are a couple of tables. And the reason I gave you the tables to look at is because I thought it might be easier to see if you have a piece of paper in front of you rather than, they will be projected eventually up there, but it may be easier to see if you have them on a piece of paper. So, all right. So number one, what is the meaning of inequality and how do we measure it? There are lots of different kinds of inequalities. I'm sure many of you will remember the horrors of having to confront inequalities in your junior high and high school math classes. Remember the less than or equal to and all that stuff that we all sort of groaned over. Well, that's not the kind of inequalities that we're working on here. This is what concerns us for this is the way in which desirable things, like income, for example, are distributed across a population. So I've got three parts. What are the desirable things? What do we mean by distribute something, or to divide it up, or to share it out? And finally, what is the significance of the given population part? So the first thing to note is that desirable things would include, of course, income and wealth, which is the main topic. I mean, economic inequality includes inequalities in the distribution of income and inequalities in the distribution of wealth. But the income and wealth actually have no real intrinsic value, do they? If I have a windfall, some extra income, I might buy a painting out in the lobby there. And then I would have something that has intrinsic value. It's valuable in and of itself. I can take it home and put it on the wall and enjoy it for a long time. But I don't want to take the dollar bill home and put it on the floor and look at it and enjoy it. So income and wealth really they have instrumental value. They're valuable for what they allow us to do, but they don't have any intrinsic value. So it's important to think that basically what's going to happen is that income and wealth can sort of stand in as proxies for other desirable things, such as good health, long life, social status, and a variety of other things that might be thought of as having inherent value. But all of those things are involved. When we think about inequality, we can be thinking about health disparities, for example. The outcomes for people with lower in the income distribution in terms of health and well-being often are worse than for people at the very top. So economic inequality can sort of stand in, at least to some extent. I have an exception to that in a minute, but it can stand in for other desirable things, but that's the issue. How are desirable things distributed? Now, the distribution issue, here's what the way I want to do it. Think about 6 people get together, they have a pizza pie. It's a very strange colored pizza pie. But in any case, it's a pizza that they want to divide up. Now the default for dividing up a pizza among 6 people is to divide it into 6 equal parts so that everybody has an equal share. That would be perfect equality. That's equality in the distribution of the pizza. And so that's the figure on the left. Now you'll see there's a little thing up at the top that says G equals 0. The G stands for Gini coefficient. Jerry warned me that people's eyes glaze over when you start talking about Gini coefficients. But I'm not going to say very much about it. All you need to know is that this is a way of measuring inequality that takes on a value of 0 if you have perfect equality. In other words, if everybody has the same amount. So you have perfect equality in the distribution of anything. In this case of pizza, but we could be doing this for income as well. So if everybody had exactly the same income, you would have perfect equality, and the Gini coefficient would be 0. If, on the other hand, one jerk eats the whole pizza and nobody else gets any, that's perfect inequality, and then the Gini coefficient takes on a value of 1. So the Gini coefficient can take values between 0 and 1, with 0 being perfect equality and 1 being perfect inequality. So what we find is we move to income and wealth, for example. These figures show unequal distributions. These are not perfectly equal, but they are not perfectly unequal either. They're somewhere in between. The one on the left, we still got the group divided into 6 groups. The thing about this is income or wealth. There are 6 groups here. The richest group gets half on the left. The next gets a quarter, and the 4 other groups each get a 16th of the total amount of income or wealth. And the Gini coefficient, it's computed there, comes out to be about 0.46, 0.4582. So it's not 1 and it's not 0, it's somewhere in between. It's a little bit less equal or more unequal than the one on the right, where the top group has a third, the next has a quarter, The one after that has a fifth and then a sixth, and then the other two have whatever's left over. And so you can see that the Gini coefficient for the one on the right is lower, it's closer to zero, so that is a more equal. It's still unequal, but it's a more equal distribution than the one on the left. Well, I don't know where that helps, but sometimes it can be very confusing to think about what these words mean. But that's what I'm thinking about, how things are shared out among people. And in our cases, it's going to be income and wealth. Oops, I have to go back here. So the third thing is the given population. What desirable things are distributed across a given population. We could do income and wealth inequality, for example, for Lincoln, for Nebraska, for the United States. We could do it for the American South or New England. We could do it for other countries. We could do it for groups of countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, European Union, or we could do it for the world as a whole. And the reason why it's worth drawing attention to that is because it's important for us to identify as we go along just exactly what we're talking about. What is the desirable thing that is being distributed, and over what population are we thinking that this is being distributed? So that's my sort of definition of what inequality is all about. We're worried about how desirable things are distributed across some particular population, and it's important as we go along to specify just what it is. The Indian economist Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize back in the late 90s in economics, he once wrote an article called Economy of What, or Inequality of What, or Equality of What? What are we talking about? What are we distributing? And he had some very interesting comments about that, which I will not go into because they're kind of technical. Now, the thing in red will come back later, and I think it's important to recognize, because sometimes we get kind of confused in public discussions about this stuff. Inequality is not the same thing as poverty. They're related in many cases, but they're not the same things. We could imagine, and don't think that this really exists, it doesn't. There is no society that is like this. But one could imagine a society where poverty is eradicated, where we've completely eliminated poverty, and yet there's still a lot of inequality. And this is going to lead to an interesting question. I mean, later on we'll have to think about if inequality is a bad thing. Is it inequality that's a bad thing, or is it the fact that the people at the bottom of the income distribution are poor? Poverty is obviously a bad thing. Poverty means that people don't have enough. Inequality means that you have less relative to others, but you might have enough. So is inequality a bad thing, or is it really poverty? And so it's important, I think, to keep the two concepts distinct as we go forward. So our focus, again, then, is economic inequality, which includes income and wealth. My students frequently sort of use income and wealth interchangeably, and I write nasty comments to them about that. Income is what we earn in a given period of time, a month or a year or something like that. And we use our income for basically three things. We use it to buy things that we're going to consume, the things that we need to live, food, clothing, shelter, and so on. We also use our income to pay taxes, right? We don't necessarily do that willingly, but we have to do that, so we pay taxes. If after you've bought your consumer goods and paid your taxes, if anything is left over, we call that savings. The savings then will go where? Well, they go into a 401k or someplace else. They then become part of the wealth. Wealth is a stock of assets: houses, cars, land, financial instruments, 401ks, insurance policies, and stocks and bonds and things of that nature. So wealth is a stock of assets that people own, and you can build those up either through your savings, your past savings, or through inheritance, for example. That often is a big, significant source of an individual's wealth. The reason why it's important to keep those two distinct is because it will turn out that wealth is always distributed less equally than income. So if you take a country we may have high income inequality, but the inequality in the distribution of wealth is almost always going to be even worse than the income inequality. So I think it's worth keeping those two things distinct. And I've made the point that income and wealth may be good indicators in many instances of other desirable things, such as good health and so on. But there is a dimension of inequality that is not really very well covered by just looking at income and wealth. This is sometimes called horizontal inequality or existential inequality. The way to think about it easily is racial or gender inequality. These are very important elements, and they aren't very well captured by inequalities of income. I mean, there is a correspondence between both racial minorities in the United States and women who have lower incomes and so on. But think about this. Social scientists have for a long time done experiments where they put together resumes that are essentially the same resume, slight differences and so on, but they're basically the same. But one set of resumes will have names that are European American, like George Watson or something, and the other will have sort of African American sounding names, like Deshaun Kelly or whatever. And it turns out that when they send these out to prospective employers in these experiments that they've got set up, there is a huge amount of discrimination in favor of the European sounding names and against the African American sounding names. Now that's a kind of inequality, that kind of racial inequality that is not perfectly captured by income inequalities. There could be an African American man who would be my age, has the same income that I have, the same amount of wealth that I have, but will have led and will continue to lead a life that is very different from mine because of the inherent racial biases that we have in our society. So we aren't going to focus all that much on the racial and gender inequality, but they will probably burble up to the surface on occasion as we go through the series. And I think that's important. We could have tried to orient the series more toward that kind of inequality than income and wealth inequalities, but I think the public discourse at the moment is more about the income and wealth inequalities, so that's what we're doing. So how do we measure this stuff? And here we go. You have this table. That has cut off one country, but it didn't cut off the most important, I guess. So the first column here shows. Don't worry too much about this. Is a technical thing. These are international dollars that have been corrected for inflation and currency exchange rates and a bunch of other stuff. So that you're using a common unit to measure these. And the first column just shows average income. It's the average income in a country. You just take all the incomes that people earn, add them all up, and divide it by the number of people in the country, and that gives you the average. This doesn't tell you very much about distribution of income within a country, but it's the kind of thing that one would look at to compare one country to another. So, for example, the country that's cut off, I think, is Russia, and Russia has significantly lower average income than does the United States. And surprisingly, the top country in this particular list is Norway, significantly ahead of the U.S. in terms of this average income. If we put in Nigeria, then you would start to see big differences between. These are all high-income countries, and so you see big differences between these countries and a country like Nigeria. The next column, so that's useful for between-country inequality. The next column is one way of approaching a measurement of inequality. This is for wealth in this particular instance, and it shows the percentage of total wealth in these various countries that is held by the richest 1% of the population. And you can see in Australia, for example, the richest 1% have 13% of total wealth in Australia. And compare that to the United States, where the richest 1% has about 37%. Clearly, we have a greater concentration of wealth, and that is an indicator that we have a less equal distribution of wealth than is the case for Australia and many other countries. So that is another way that economists and others use to try to get a handle. You could do this for income as well as for wealth. And so just, what proportion of total income goes to the richest 1% or the richest 10% as an indicator of inequality. The next column there, I'll just do the 10%. Suppose that we have about 100,000 households in Lincoln, And we go out and we find the 10,000 households where the people that have the lowest income. And we figure out the total income, we add up all the incomes to these 10,000 people, and we come up with an amount. And then we do the same thing for the richest 10,000 families, the richest 10% of the families in Lincoln. And you divide, then you total their income, and then you divide the top income group, their total income, by the income going to the bottom 10%, and you'll get a number. And the bigger the number is, the greater the distance between the top and the bottom. Does that make sense? Hopefully it makes sense. So you're going to see for the United States, when you do that at 10%, the richest 10% in the United States have 15 times as much income as the poorest 10%. That doesn't mean very much just right off the bat, but if you look at Norway and Japan, it's about 5. So Norway and Japan, the richest 10% have about 5 times the income of the poorest 10%, whereas the United States, it's 15. That clearly suggests that we have a less equal distribution of income in the US. Then the next, we'll skip the 20%, really, it shows exactly the same thing, it's just the numbers are a little bit different, but it's the same idea. Then we get to our friend the Gini coefficient, and the point that's made here, I think, is very important because, again, when do we measure things for computing things like measures of inequality? We measure the inequality on the basis of what people earn on their own, or do we measure it after people have taken their earnings and paid taxes and received transfers from the government, for example, and so on. So that's the 2 columns. One column is income inequality measured before we take account of taxes, which are somewhat progressive in many countries, and before we take account of government transfers to people. Now, these government transfers, I recently reached the age where it made no sense to not start taking my Social Security payments. Sort of forced to do that. I'm still working, but I'm getting Social Security payments. Social Security payments would be one kind of transfer from the government. Food stamps would be another, various other kinds of government safety net programs that result in income transfers to people. So after you take that into account, you can just scan down the column there. I mean, it's pretty interesting. The level of inequality is much higher just before you take account of these government interventions. The government interventions through taxation and government transfers lowers the level of inequality quite substantially. So the welfare state, the social safety net, does do something, right? It lowers inequality by a significant amount in many countries. In Denmark, I think, Denmark, France, and Germany, it's over 40%. The level of inequality falls as a result of government intervention. In the US, it's only 22%. Our social safety net is not as generous as you find in a lot of European countries for various reasons, right? I mean, this is our politics and our history and all the rest of that stuff goes into that. But it is interesting that we have some impact, some change. Now, most of the Gini coefficients that you will see are ones that are they're based on surveys, and they include taxation and government transfers. So the column next to last there is probably the range of Gini coefficients that you most commonly would see. All right, so that's. Hope that's okay. We've got some measurement stuff there, and maybe it gives you an idea of how we might go about measuring things. So let's think a little bit about how inequality has evolved through time. I like very much in my honors seminars to have the students read something that is kind of a classic, something from the past, because it's always good to struggle with the differences in language and all the rest of that. So I found the perfect thing. This is the discourse on the origin of the foundations of inequality among men. I'm not sure whether women counted in 1755, but in any case, that's what the title is. It was written in French, and I have the French version, and it says men in French as well. So this is kind of interesting because the city of Dijon in France organized a competition, write an essay on the origin and foundation of inequality among men. So Rousseau wrote his essay, his discourse, and entered it into this competition, and he won, lo and behold. And if you want to read something sort of strange and unusual, this is very strange and unusual in many instances. He makes some very strange kind of claims about how people may have lived, early human beings. But in any case, what he notes is that the early human beings were generally living in egalitarian society. He didn't really think people lived in societies, but the situation was very egalitarian prior to the invention of agriculture. He points that the invention of agriculture and metallurgy, if you can read the long quote there at the bottom, it's, when you have agriculture and you get property, and he says, so the vast forests were changed into smiling fields which had to be watered with the sweat of men, and in which slavery and misery were soon seen to germinate and grow with the crops. So the origin of human inequality and misery and so on is the invention of agriculture, and the need that generated for people to recognize property, that there's such a thing as property, people have property rights. And so Rousseau actually thought that the rich people who had property kind of duped the general public into accepting a government with laws that actually worked to the advantage of those who had property, because the laws were designed to protect property rights and so on. That's his story. That's not my story, but that was his story. And so it was agriculture that triggered the rise in inequality among human beings. And I have to go back here. Let's see. There is something to this, it would seem. The archaeological records suggest that the Neolithic Revolution was when agriculture was first developed, about 10,000 years ago. So humans have been, fully modern humans, according to a National Geographic site I went to, have been around for about 200,000 years, and for 95% of our existence, we made our living as hunter-gatherers wandering around in fairly egalitarian small bands. With the invention, how would anybody know this? With the invention of agriculture, we start to see greater inequality. Well, here's one way that people can figure this out. Using skeletal remains, you look at men and you figure out male skeletons of similar ages, and prior to the invention of agriculture, they're all about the same height. The height, tallness of people is a good measure of their nutritional circumstances, and so they're largely about the same. With the invention of agriculture, you start to get a lot of variation in how tall people were, and that reflects the inequality that was right. So that's one way that maybe the archaeologists can do this. I'm not an archaeologist, so my apologies to those who may know more about this than I. But it does seem like the early societies were generally fairly egalitarian, and then with the invention of agriculture, you started to get differentiation. Now, lest you think that this was some kind of Rousseauian paradise back there, Steven Pinker, in the book The Better Angels of Our Nature, has shown quite convincingly that the likelihood that you died from having your head bashed in by another person were much higher back in the early human societies than is the case today. And that seems completely nuts, doesn't it? With ISIS and terrorists and stuff like that. The thing is, I'm quite convinced. I've read at least parts of Pinker's book, and I think he's absolutely right. I consulted with a friend of mine, Peter Bleed, who was an archaeologist. He said it's exactly right, that these early societies were extraordinarily violent. They may have been egalitarian, but they were not paradises of joy and harmony. And there are a lot of other scholars who have looked at the evolution of human beings and agreed that the pre-agricultural societies, the hunting-gathering societies, were often generally pretty egalitarian, and that agriculture led to a rise in inequality. So the centuries that followed, then, what we end up with is we have differentiation, we have stratification of societies. There's an elite that is sort of building empires and doing other sorts of things. Most people were living lives of living lives of as subsistence farmers. They were in small rural communities doing agriculture as their main occupation. What I mean by subsistence here is that they were generating just enough food and resources for the population to not die out, essentially, so that enough people would grow to be able to reproduce so that the population would continue to exist. That's sort of a subsistence kind of level. Now, one explanation for this kind of situation comes from our friend Malthus, who, as you all know, made the case that population tends to grow faster than the food supply. And so therefore, population always has to be brought back in line with the available amount of food through various kinds of misery. Pestilence and famine and wars and vice. He made a big deal about vice. People would go to prostitutes or something, to keep population in line with the food supplies. One of the implications of Malthus's model that doesn't get a lot of attention, but is very clear. What happens then is the population will always put pressures on the food supply, yes, but I mean, what it will do is population growth will always go to the extent that it drives average incomes down to this subsistence level. So that's an implication of Malthus's description, that basically you're going to end up with population growth ensuring that you never get an average income that is much above subsistence. There can be variations. The Black Death killed about a third of Europe. Wages went up because there was a shortage of labor. Incomes went up for a bit, but then population grew and replaced that. And so this chart from a book by Gregory Clark shows average incomes. And I want to emphasize, before anybody gets sort of carried away here, these are some estimates of real income, which means that there's no inflation in this. So when things start to go up on the right-hand side of it, see, it's not because of inflation. It's because people really are getting higher incomes. And so what Malthus wrote the essay on population in 1798. So you can see where 1800 is. And his model was spot on for the 600 years prior to his penning of the essay on population. But he kind of missed the Industrial Revolution and what that would do. And so what did the Industrial Revolution do? Well, it led to rising incomes. It led to better health, greater longevity. Life expectancy at birth when Malthus wrote the essay was 40 in England, and today it's 80. And England, in 1800, England had the longest life expectancy. Every place else on the planet, the life expectancy was less than 40. Today, the average life expectancy for the planet as a whole is almost 70. It's about 70. So we live longer, we're stronger. Food production throughout the 19th century kept up with population, and in the 20th century, food production has outstripped population growth. So a lot of things that Malthus could not have predicted have come to pass. And one of the things, but a couple of things that happened, so the Industrial Revolution changed the way we live and made things better in many respects, but it also did lead to an increase in inequality. As the 19th century progressed, you had Marx was very concerned about this, the concentration of capital in the hands of a smaller number of capitalists and so on, that he predicted would cause capitalism to self-destruct at some point. But the concentration of capital in the hands of a smaller number of people and led to this growing inequality in the industrialized countries. That led at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, to what we call the Gilded Age. The French call it La Belle Époque, and it's the same kind of deal for them in France. What happened is, so we end up at the end of the 19th century with this industrialization having led to a great deal of inequality. This is the age of the robber barons and all the rest of that stuff. The other thing that the Industrial Revolution did was it did not happen every place. It didn't happen in all countries of the world. So while the industrialized high-income countries of North America and Western Europe and so on were seeing average incomes increase quite substantially, the rest of the world was still kind of stuck in this Malthusian agrarian world with most people living in sort of subsistence levels. So the distance between Africa, Asia, and Latin America and the industrialized countries of Western Europe and North America grew much greater. So you had an increase in between-country inequality as well as increasing inequality within the industrialized countries. So what happened then after the beginning of the 20th century, interestingly enough, is that level of inequality, again, this is mainly in Western Europe and North America, inequality began to fall in the 20th century for various reasons. The wars, the Great Depression, began to fall particularly after the Second World War, when we had GI Bills and things like that in the US, with greater access to education and so on. So inequality began to fall very substantially in the course of the 20th century. Simon Kuznets, who's kind of the father of inequality studies, he won the Nobel Prize in the mid-50s, and he sort of detected a pattern of what was going on in the world that he thought he saw. This is known as the Kuznets curve, and what's being measured here is on a horizontal axis, as you go to the right, average incomes increase. For the vertical axis, as you go north, inequality is increasing. So what he suggested was that you'd have sort of low-income countries with a great deal of equality. They would have low inequality, but low incomes. As they began to industrialize, their incomes would go up, but inequality would go up as well, till you reach a peak, after which increasing incomes lead to a fall in inequality. So this is lots of articles and tons of ink spilled over this kind of idea. It seemed to be sort of sensible until we started getting to the 70s. And now don't pay much attention to where the countries are on this. This is somebody else's thing. I just wanted the shape of the deal. What happened is that in the 70s, inequality started to go back up. The Kuznets curve did not allow for that. It said it goes up and then it comes down, but it did not predict that we were going to have to go back up after a while. So that raised kind of a problem there. Here is one indicator of what happened in the 20th century in the United States. Now, this is a measure based on the proportion of total income that goes to the richest 1% in the U.S. And you can see in the early part of the century, it was around 15 to 20%. The richest 1% were getting about 15 to 20% of income. And then it began to fall a little bit in the 40s, 30s and 40s, particularly after the Second World War. It got down to about 9% by 1978, after which it started to go back up. Now, it's this bit about where it's going back up after 1980. This is what has got everybody talking about inequality these days. This is what people have been noticing. That over the past about 50 years or so, past maybe 40 years, there has been increasing inequality in the U.S. and in many other countries, and this has gotten people sort of concentrated. Here's another measure of it. This is the Gini coefficient that a French guy has a French blog. He obviously has an agenda because he has another one for England that has Thatcher in it. This has Reagan Bush. So he's trying to tell us something. I won't tell you what. But anyway, it shows the same pattern. Okay, so that's income. So now what about wealth? Remember, we want to keep these two things separate. What happened to wealth over the course of the 20th century? Well, the far chart there shows the dark line is the amount of the percentage of total wealth held by the bottom 90% of the population. The lighter line is the amount of wealth held by the top 10th of 1% of the population. In 2015, there are about 126 million households in the United States. So the top 10th of 1% is 126,000. The bottom 90% would be 113.4 million. So one very large group and one very small group. And you can see at the beginning of the century, they both have more or less the same share of total wealth. But then the share held by the bottom 90% increases, while the share held by the top 1% decreases, until you get about the 70s or 80s, and then they start to go back together. So today, the two are about equal. The map of the United States is sort of interesting. I'm not going to waste time on that. This is what it would look like if you distributed the land in the United States the way that wealth is distributed in the United States. The part that I like the best is that the bottom 40% would get a red dot located somewhere around Austin or San Antonio or something like that. The top thing is interesting because the top bar shows the actual proportion of wealth held by different groups. So in the top 20%, the richest 20% have about 82% of total wealth. What Americans think on average, the distribution is in the middle. And so people think that wealth is not very well distributed, but it's about, the top 20% have about 60%. And what people would prefer, I think would be a better deal, would be something like the top 20% having about 36 or 37%. So what at least on the surface, people would prefer is a very long way from what really is out there, and we underestimate the extent to which it is okay, so what's going on? Basically, what I'm going to do here is do the three-way thing. Inequality within countries, between countries, and then inequality for the globe as a whole. So inequality within countries, basically economic inequality seems to be rising pretty much everywhere. Our inequality in the US is higher than it is in other high-income countries, although even in Scandinavian countries, inequality is increasing. Low-income developing countries are quite various. Ethiopia and Pakistan have very equal distributions. They have very low Gini coefficients, and they're very poor. But on the other hand, Zambia, Honduras, and South Africa have high degrees of inequality. So the developing countries are kind of all over the place. The country with the highest level of inequality is probably South Africa. The lowest levels are in Scandinavia. Historically, Latin America had very high levels of income inequality, but in recent years that has come down a bit. So Brazil used to have the highest level of inequality, and they have made some progress in lowering that. So here's the second table, and this has got lots of numbers in it. Here's what I think that we can do. Basically what this shows, the heart of the table, is that the first column of numbers is the proportion of total income that goes to the poorest 20%. So in Norway, the poorest 20% of Norwegians get altogether 9.3% of total income. And in all of the sort of egalitarian countries at the top there, 8 or 9%. The poorest 20% get 8 or 9% of total income. Now, if you scan down that column, by the time you get to the bottom, you'll see that at the most unequal countries, the poorest 20% only get 3 or 4% of total income. You can do the same thing on the column of the richest 20%, and there you find that the egalitarian countries, the richest 20% get about 35-40% of total income, and then as you scan down, you get to South Africa at 69%, but the other countries, 55-60%. So I think that shows the purpose of this is just to say there is a lot of variation out there in terms of the degree of inequality that we find around the world. And these differences are interesting. I'm not going to talk about why there are all these differences. It's history, it's culture, it's policy, it's a whole bunch of things. But the world is quite variable with respect to this thing. Now, one of the sort of stories, this comes from this book by Branko Milanovic, Global Inequality, that he suggests that what's going on in the world is that rather than thinking about Kuznets curves, remember the Kuznets curve, the thing goes like that, he says what we really should think about is Kuznets waves, so that the high-income countries in Europe and North America have finished the first Kuznets wave. They've gone up the Kuznets wave and down, with high inequality, low to high inequality and back down. And now we're climbing up a second Kuznets wave. Meanwhile, China is just beginning to industrialize, so China is climbing up its first Kuznets wave, and he predicts that they're near the top of that, and that inequality will begin. Inequality in China and the US are just about equal, which is quite extraordinary when you think about it, because we're all, I think many of us are old enough to remember Mao's little red book and all the stuff in the 60s and 70s and so on. China was always a very egalitarian place. It was the whole idea, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs, and all that sort of thing. But when China embarked on its recent sort of industrialization, inequality began to rise very substantially there. It's mainly an inequality between the sort of growing middle class on the coasts and the rural farmers in the interior who are very poor, and so on. So inequality in China is now about the same as in the United States. But Milanovic thinks it'll go down. With the US, he thinks it may still keep going up. I'm not sure about that. So what we do have then this image then of rising current inequality. What causes that? What is exactly going on here? Well, there's a lot of things, and this is not an exhaustive list, but the first two things have to do with technological change. And a lot of people point to technological change as one of the drivers of increasing inequality. In fact, one could take this little bit thing down at the bottom where what we've done, we started off as hunter-gatherers, and then there was the Neolithic Revolution, and we transitioned to agriculture, and that led to an increase in inequality. Then, after a while, we had an industrial revolution and transitioned from agriculture to manufacturing, and that led to an increase in inequality. And some people say now we are doing a third transition from manufacturing to services. About somewhere between 75 and 80% of the U.S. economy is services. We don't manufacture very much anymore. So this transition to services with the information communications technology revolution may be what's leading to another increase in inequality. But technology, the sort of observation that a lot of economists have made is that much of the technology that's been introduced requires skilled labor. So there's a premium for skilled workers and a fall in demand for unskilled workers or skilled workers with fewer skills, and that contributes to inequality. So one of the main causes some people think of inequality is the technological change that has a bias in favor of skilled type industries that require skilled labor. This is sort of complemented by the other part of the technological change, which is is part of the same thing, is substituting machines and robots for workers. I mean, if you've watched in recent years when they show what's going on the assembly line in an automobile manufacturing plant in Detroit, you don't see a lot of people. You see all these robots going around doing the welding and stuff, you know. So machines have replaced a lot of workers, and that means that there's less demand for limited skill workers. Another thing that people point to is, obviously, this is the common perception out there, is that globalization of trade has led to redundancy of a lot of workers and lower wages. And there's some indications that for workers with modest skills, there has been downward pressure on wages as a result of trade. But trade also creates jobs. The problem is that the kinds of jobs that are being created by trade and globalization are not jobs into which people who are being displaced can go because they don't have the appropriate types of skills. So both technological change and globalization may be contributing to increasing inequality. I'm going to argue that we don't want to stop globalization and technological change because these things bring about a lot of very good things. But understanding the process that may be contributing to a higher inequality, we might be able to manage them in some way that would reduce the collateral damage. Another thing people point to is the decline of organized labor. This next thing, there's been a lot of change in structures of families. Assortative mating, this is the idea that like people marry like people. The image is that in the past it was common for a high-income doctor to marry a low-income nurse, or a high-income business executive to marry a low-income secretary, so you kind of get mixing up with people. And now it's much more common for a high-income doctor to marry another high-income doctor, which gives you two high incomes, and this assortative mating, the fact that, we have this problem at the university all the time. Whenever we want to hire somebody, she or he comes with a spouse, and we have to find and they both have PhDs in something, and we have to try to find another job. So there seems to be a tendency for increasingly for two high-income people to get together and get married. And that means that at the other end, it's more common for people of modest means to marry other people of modest means, and that can contribute to some inequality. Business practices that might reward super managers and that also may lead to stagnant wages for workers, and then public policies. The fact that we haven't raised the minimum wage, educational access, and tax loopholes for the rich, and all those kinds of public policies that may have contributed. So that's sort of what people have pointed to for as causes within countries. Between countries, we have a slightly different story. I mean, this is kind of interesting because what's going on between countries, as you all know,
You have places like China and India, Indonesia, Vietnam, mostly in Asia, but to some extent Brazil and some other countries as well, that have begun to grow very rapidly. Again, if Milanovic is right, they're going up their first Kuznets curve, Kuznets wave, if you will. The disparity between the US and sub-Saharan Africa is quite huge, but overall, the distance between the high-income countries and the low and moderate income countries has shrunk. So I did some calculations. In 1990, average income in high-income countries was 23 times the average income in the low and middle income countries. And by 2015, that had fallen to 9 times as much. So there is some catching up that is going on. It's uneven. There's not a lot of catching up going on in sub-Saharan Africa, but the developing countries are beginning to catch up. And that sort of shrinks the distance between the high and low. And Milanovic notes that for the first time it may make some sense to talk about middle class. So you've all obviously noticed this is actually an early version of Milanovic's chart, and some wise guy made it into an elephant, and so we know it's the elephant graph. But anyway, this is complicated, but what's going on here is that the people are arrayed from poorest to richest, from left to right. So the folks who are at the 80th percentile actually have a higher average income than people at lower levels. But what's being measured is how much incomes increased in the period between 1988 and 2008. So the people at A, who have a lower income than the people at B, saw their incomes increase by 75% or more over that time period. Whereas the people at B didn't see any increase in their incomes. And the people at C, these are the global plutocrats, the gazillionaires out there, and their incomes went up quite a lot as well. Now, the people at B are largely, in that 80 to 90 range, are largely the lower half of the income distribution in the US, France, Germany, high-income countries. And so these are the folks that seem to be feeling left behind and probably are being left behind as the folks in Asia, this new emerging Asian middle class, sort of start to catch up and seem to be doing quite well. So I think that's kind of interesting. So global inequality, and this is for the whole world as a whole. Global inequality, what is happening with that? Well, Milanovic argues, and I think this is an interesting way of thinking about it. There's two forces going on. There's within country inequality is increasing, but the between country inequality seems to be shrinking a little bit. And so he says overall global inequality, which is very high. I mean, the Gini coefficient for global inequality is about 0.7, much higher than for any individual country. That makes pretty good sense, I think, if you're comparing the people who live, the Mother Teresa people in Calcutta against our gazillionaires people over here. The disparity is going to be much larger. And so inequality globally is much higher. But Milanovic predicts that the future of global inequality depends on which trend wins out. Will the trend for increasing within country inequality set the tone for the future, or will the trend in reducing between country inequality prevail and lead to a reduction in global inequality? And he does not have an answer for that, but it's sort of interesting. In the process of making these kinds of arguments, he does point to something that I think is very important, particularly for us to keep in mind as folks who are probably pretty well-to-do relative to the rest of the world. He argues that those of us born into a country like the United States have this enormous citizenship premium that we get just by virtue of having been born here. And he did some statistical stuff, and whether these numbers make any sense or not, this is what he came up with. It's about 80% of our income, the income that I have, for example, could be explained by two things. The fact that I was born in the United States and the income of my parents. Those two things determine 80% of where I am now. How much of where I am now is determined by my hard work. And I worked hard. I kept my nose to the grindstone and all that sort of thing. But on the other hand, I had the good fortune to be born a white male in the United States. There's a whole lot of luck that's been involved. And so when you get through with the gender, the race, the luck, the parents' income, the fact that we were born in the United States, and so there isn't a whole lot left that we are responsible for all by ourselves. Now, this may be overstating things quite a bit, and I think it's useful to do that just to stimulate some conversation and some thoughts. But I'm inclined to think that, well, I won't speak for anybody else, but for me, I've been damn lucky in what happened, and I didn't have anything to do with that. I mean, this is all sort of the accident of birth that did an awful lot for determining where I ended up. Well, so that then is the end of part 3. And we're at 15 past, so why don't we take a little break? What we can do afterwards, I may just go ahead and go through these slides. You have them, and so you may be somewhat familiar with what's in these slides. Well, those of you who have the... Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's the last 2 pages. So let's take a little break, and then we'll come back, and we can maybe get you all involved in the conversation. Okay.